Hey folks, Tim Newman. It's time for another edition in our ongoing series, Mastering Photoshop. In today's video, we're going to continue on right where we left off after our part 1 Introducing Photoshop Layers video. Today, we're going to dig a little further into layers and begin to take a look at multiple layer documents, ways by which we can manage layers, and how layers can potentially interact with one another. Let's take a look at this sample Photoshop document. So when we were last here looking at the Photoshop Layers series, our intro part 1 video, we had just wrapped up taking a look at a new blank document in Photoshop. And the fact that it was a blank document was a bit of a misnomer because we discovered via the new document dialog box that we were in fact creating a document that had a background layer, as we can see here, that was indeed full of pixels that, as we can see here, are all white. And as we might recall, that background layer was by default locked for us. So we're going to unlock this layer like we did in the last video. You can see, as you might recall, this becomes layer 0, and we now have this single layer all full of white pixels that is available to us to be edited. Now, it's important for us to remember that these are indeed all white pixels, and I would really like us to confirm that fact by doing a Command A on the Mac, a Control A on Windows, to draw a selection around the entire layer, and in this case the entire document because there's only one layer, meaning that we have selected every pixel that's in this document. And if I hit the delete key, you notice that this layer instantly transitions over to the checkerboard pattern that indicates transparency in Photoshop. So that's right, we took every one of these pixels and we made it transparent or see-through. Now, I'm not going to extol the virtues of transparency at this moment in time. Trust me, there are lots of different ways that transparency can be used. And suffice it to say, we will come back and cover that in future layers videos. But for right now, let's just accept at face value that we have emptied out any content that was in these pixels on this layer. Now we still have our little marching ants trucking around our layer here, as we can see on the outside here. And what we'd like to do is get rid of those, or get rid of that selection, if you will. And that's as easy as a Command D on the Mac or a Control D on Windows. And now that selection and thus the marching ants have all gone away. So we now do truly have a empty single layer document in Photoshop. And this puts us in a really great place to explore some of the multiple layer capabilities that exist in Photoshop. So the first thing we're going to do in order to start exploring those is to create a second layer. So we have multiple layers, and the create new layer icon hangs out right here in the layers control panel. And if I click on this, I will get a new layer created immediately above the layer that I was just on. And one of the things that I want to point out here real quickly, now that we have 2 layers in a document, is any layer that has the gray control strip on it is considered to be the active layer or active selection of layers if you have selected more than one layer, and we'll see that in a little bit later. So if I come down here and click on this layer strip right here, this is now the active layer in Photoshop. And if I again come up here and click on this layer, this is now the active layer in Photoshop. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means any pixels that you paint on this image or fill in with color are going to go on this layer 1. None of them will go on layer 0 because it's not the active layer. And any tool that you use in Photoshop that performs any kind of edit or adjustment, that's going to happen on the pixels that are on layer 1. And that's important to keep in mind because so many times when people start working with multiple layer documents and they're new at it, they forget what the active layer is. They start drawing and they're not drawing, or they're not paintbrushing, or they're not erasing or dodging or burning on the correct layer. Always come over here and confirm, hey, which of these layers is active? Now it's layer 0. Now it's layer 1. Am I getting ready to edit on the layer that I intend to edit on? All right, so that's a real quick insight into active layers. Now, in order to start to explore this multiple layer concept in Photoshop, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to have two transparent layers, which is what we can see here. So what we're going to do with layer 1 active is we are going to select the paint bucket tool by hitting the G key. And you'll notice as soon as I hit the G key, I get the paint bucket tool icon here, and the paint bucket tool becomes visible over here in the tool list. Now, if I hit the G key and I get something that looks like that, or I get something that looks like this crosshair, and I get this little gradient rectangle over here, that just tells me I have the wrong tool selected in that tool set. And as you recall, studying other tools in Photoshop, more than one tool can exist in a tool space in the toolbar, and hitting the G key over and over and over again will take you in a cyclical fashion through all those tools. So I'm just going to click on the paint bucket tool here, the very first one, and make sure it's active so I know that I have the correct tool. Now right now, if we were to paint, we would paint with the foreground color, as long as it says foreground up here in the tool option strip, or option bar, if you will. And if it says pattern, then we're going to paint with something completely different, whatever this pattern is here. But we're going to take it back to the default of foreground. So we're painting with a foreground color. And right now our foreground color is displayed over here. It's white. Well, that's not particularly exciting. We just got rid of all the white pixels. So what we're going to do is we are going to click on this square to set the foreground color. And what I would like is to fill this foreground in with all blue. Now, I can come down through here and I can say, hey, where are the blues? There's blue, let's pick a blue, so on and so forth. Or I can come out here and sample a color if one existed in my document. But in this case, I want to be really precise about the fact that it's 100% blue. So I can come down here to the RGB controls here in the color picker dialog box and specify how much red, green, and blue is here. Now these are the RGB channels in the document, and if you remember your bit depth math that we talked about in the first video, we can have a level here of red, green, or blue from 0 to 255. So if I set 0 red and I set 0 green, and I tab over here to this last one and I put in 255 for blue, I'm going to get an absolutely pure blue as far as Photoshop's concerned. And now if I click here in the middle of this empty layer, I will get a layer that's all filled with blue. Now over here in the layers control panel, probably a good time to come over here and double click on the word layer. You'll notice that all the letters in that word become highlighted and the editing field is open for editing. With all of them highlighted, if I start typing, all those letters will go away, and when I type in the word blue here, that will replace them. When I'm happy with the letter I have here, I simply hit the return or enter key, and that is now the name for that layer. So we now have a layer that's completely filled with blue pixels and is named blue. Now I can turn this layer's visibility on and off real easily. The blue layer is still there. We've just simply said don't display it by virtue of clicking on or off this layer visibility icon. So let's go ahead and leave it on here. All right, so now we've got our all blue layer back turned on and being displayed. Now what we'd like to do is we'd like to add another layer to our document. But before we do that, I want to have a quick conversation with you about how Photoshop interprets adding new layers. Photoshop is going to add a new layer if I use the new layer icon on top of the currently active layer. So here the blue layer is active, and I know this because the layer strip is in that light gray indicating that it's active or selected. So if I click on the new layer icon, that new layer is going to get created right up above the blue layer right here. On the other hand, if I come down here and make layer 0 active, and I come down here and click on the create new layer icon, which I'm going to go ahead and do at this point, you'll notice that my new layer gets created right above that layer 0 that was active, but below the blue layer that was already there. So in fact, Photoshop did exactly what I asked it to do. I had layer 0 active. I said, create a new layer for me. It said, sure, I'll put it right above the one that's active. Now, if I don't want it there, real easy. I can come up here and click on the layer strip for layer 1 and not let go with the mouse button and drag this layer up, and you'll see it become kind of transparent. And if I get up far enough, all of a sudden you'll see that blue line above the blue layer. That means this layer is going to dock itself there when I let go. So real easy for me to come into Photoshop and move layers around in any order that I want them to be in. Now, this may seem a bit arbitrary, but it's not. It's incredibly important. Layers interact with Photoshop in the order that they exist within the layers control panel. And if you want an analogy for this, think back to your high school days when they used acetate sheets and an overhead projection system. Whatever acetate sheet was on top, that was the one that was on the top of the stack, and it covered up potentially anything that was underneath it. Or if you happen to have a acetate sheet with blue symbols on it and an acetate sheet with red symbols on it, and that red and blue were somewhat transparent, then we would have those two colors mixed together and potentially give us a purple or magenta color. Okay, so with this new layer 1 on top and it being the active layer strip here, I would like to fill this layer with the color red. Now, I've already got the paint bucket tool turned on. I can tell that one of two ways very quickly. One is I can look at the icon and I see a pointer with the paint bucket tool, and if I come over here to the toolbar, I can see that this tool is in fact the one that's highlighted in the tool strip. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to see real quickly, but that's how you confirm, is this tool is outlined in a different color from all the rest of them in the toolbar. Now, if we go back down to our current foreground and background colors, we can see that our foreground color is blue and our background color is black. So we want to reset the foreground color. We're simply going to click on that blue square. Up comes our color picker dialog box again, and all the settings are in there from the last time that we were in here changing the red, green, and blue channel settings. So if we want 100% red, we know that that's a level of 255. So I'm going to double click right here next to the red button in the level box, and I'm going to type in 255. Now I'm going to tab down to green. Well, green is at 0. We don't have to do much there. And now I'm going to tab down to blue, and I'd like to set its level to 0 as well. Look at that. Now we have pure red set as our red, green, blue color mix right here. So I'm going to click on OK to keep that color, and like I did last time, I'm going to come over here and click right in the middle of this layer, and it will fill with red. And real quickly, before we move on to a couple of other concepts, let's come back over here to the Layers Control panel, double click on Layer 1, and then let's entitle this Red. So it is now the red layer in this document. Now it's interesting, it would appear that all of our blue pixels have disappeared if we look over here in the document itself, but if we look over here in the Layers Control panel, we can indeed see that we do have a layer here that appears to be all full of blue, and simply it is being covered up by the red pixels that we just created above it. So as we turn this red layer on and off with this visibility icon, something should become quite clear to us, that these red pixels that are in this red layer must be 100% opaque, or conversely 0% transparent, meaning that we cannot see through to anything that is underneath this red layer, even though it is still there. And if we think back real quickly to changing layer order, that should also tell us that, hey, if we take this blue layer and we drag it up here and make it the top layer, then it will really appear as if the red layer has disappeared and the blue layer is now there. But again, toggling that visibility icon on and off for that blue layer shows us that the red layer is indeed still there. Okay, I'm going to take the red layer and put it back on top one more time. Okay, we want to cover one last concept here before we end this part 2 of our introduction to layers tutorial in Photoshop, and that is the notion of opacity and the interaction between multiple layers. Now, this concept in and of itself can go on for a long time. It will be the source of at least a couple more videos here in this series. So we're just going to whet your appetite with it here and leave you with a little bit of an understanding about how these layers can potentially interact with one another. So we said that obviously the red layer was full of 100% opaque red pixels. Well, we can come up here to this red layer and we can change its opacity. We can say, hey, let's take everything in this layer and make it 50% opaque, or I'll get pretty close to 50%. Good enough. Hey, I got it. Now you'll notice our red seems to have gone away, and we now have this layer of magenta pixels here in our document. But if we come back over here and reflect upon the contents of the layers control panel, you'll see that that in fact is not true. We still have a layer of red pixels. We still have a layer of blue pixels. They haven't changed. We've simply told Photoshop, for this layer that's active, change its opacity to 50%. And what I want to demonstrate for you here real quickly is opacity is set at a layer by layer perspective. Meaning if I come here to this blue layer, you can see that it is 100% opaque, but going back to this red layer, it is 50% opaque. If I take this blue layer and I drag it on top of this red layer, that opacity in the red layer no longer matters at the moment because the blue layer is completely covering it up. But it's important to remember that that opacity setting traveled along with that layer and its order in the layers control panel. And if in fact I turn off visibility for the blue layer, red is still 50% opaque, and that 50% opacity is blending with these transparent pixels beneath it, essentially giving us a red layer that is 50% opaque, or conversely 50% transparent. Let's turn that blue layer back on, and let's take that red layer and drag it back up to the top of the stack. And I think you can really quickly see how layer opacity follows the layers around in the multiple layer stack in the layers control panel. All right, we'll have a couple of thoughts to wrap up this part 2 introduction, and then we'll be out of here. Well, there you have it, folks. An introduction to some of the multiple layer concepts within Photoshop documents. Hopefully by now you have a pretty good idea of how to create a new blank layer, how to rename and reorder those layers if need be, and a little bit of a taste of how layers potentially interact with one another. I promise you we just scratched the surface here and there's a lot more to come, but I think this starts to give you just a little bit of a notion of how much power that layers bring to Photoshop editing. Hope you enjoyed this video. Check down there at the bottom for the subscribe button. Click on that. Make sure you stay up to date with what Softlight Studios is publishing next. And remember, as we always say, learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.